Today, I want to share a story so intense it pulls you straight into the dust and cold of the old Wild West. A place where survival is earned, not promised, and silence can be more dangerous than gunfire. Here lives Collide at the edge of fear, where one decision can bind strangers together against an unseen threat. It all started with 4 exhausted women stepping onto a ranch at dusk. An ordinary moment that would quietly rewrite every future involved. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cold evening stretched wide across the open range as the sun slipped behind the low hills, bleeding the sky into long bands of dull orange and ash gray. Wade Mercer crossed the yard at his usual measured pace, each step marked by a slight drag in his right leg. The limp had been part of him for years now, a reminder of work he never spoke about and never planned to return to. A bucket of water swung from his hand as he headed toward the trough, breathing in the dry bite of dust and the faint metallic chill rising off the barn roof. Silence wrapped the land like a second skin. It was a quiet Wade had learned to live inside. No voices, no footsteps, no schedules but his own. He had been alone on this ranch for nearly 10 years. Once, he'd been a gun for hire, drifting from one job to the next until the work hollowed him out deeper than any wound ever could. Walking away hadn't healed him, but it had stopped the bleeding. The ranch kept his hands busy and his thoughts in check. Fences to mend, 2 horses, dust and cinder to tend, tools to sharpen. None of it asked questions. None of it demanded trust. The last time he'd let someone get close, it had cost him sleep and left him waking in the dark with his chest tight and his mouth dry. A quiet life had felt safer than risking that again. As he set the bucket down, movement caught his eye along the ridge. It wasn't a horse. The motion was wrong, too slow, too uneven. Wade stilled and focused. A thin line of figures moved across the land, spaced just far enough apart to suggest caution. Their steps dragged, heavy and unsteady. He saw no weapons. Their posture spoke of exhaustion, the kind that came from traveling too far with too little food or rest. Wade straightened, muscles tightening as instincts from another life surfaced without warning. He wasn't afraid. He was alert. The figures reached the edge of his yard. As they drew closer, details sharpened. Torn skirts, worn leggings, shawls shredded by wind and sand. Their faces bore the marks of hard travel. Cracked lips, dirt ground into skin, hair tangled and dulled at the ends. 4 women. No men. Grief lived plainly in their eyes before a single word was spoken. It was a look Wade recognized. He'd worn it himself through too many quiet nights after too much loss. The tallest woman stepped forward. She held herself straight, though exhaustion weighed heavy in her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was steady but strained. "We need shelter for one night." She offered no explanation, no names, no stories about where they'd come from or what they were running from. The request stood on its own, carried with a controlled dignity that caught Wade off guard. The silence that followed stretched tight between them. The others waited behind her. One, shorter, soft-faced, clutched a small bundle to her chest, her hands trembling. Another stood taller, jaw set hard, eyes tracking Wade as if ready to shield the group at the first sign of danger. The youngest kept her gaze lowered, blinking slow, fighting exhaustion. Wade felt the familiar weight of decision settle into his chest, the same pull he'd felt years ago before taking on a risky job. But this wasn't about tracking someone down or standing his ground with a gun. This was about opening his door. These women carried more than hunger. They carried fear. They carried the pressure of being hunted. The thought of turning them away tightened something deep inside him. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. They climbed the porch slowly, knees unsteady from the cold and the long road behind them. When Wade pushed the door open, warm air from the stove rolled out to meet them. They entered cautiously, eyes scanning the small, single-room cabin. Everything inside was plain. A cot against the left wall, a rough table at the center, tools, blankets, and supplies stacked neatly toward the back. Wade closed the door and stayed near it, giving them space. He didn't know what they expected from him. He wasn't sure what he could offer beyond the basics. Still, he crossed to the stove, lifted the lid from a pot of leftover stew, and set it on the table. He placed 5 chipped bowls beside it, then stepped back again. He didn't reassure them. He didn't ask questions. People who had walked this far didn't need interrogation. They needed warmth. They needed to sit without constantly checking their backs. The women approached the table carefully. Their movements were stiff, hands shaking slightly as they served themselves. The soft clink of spoons against bowls echoed through the room. The leader, Ashira, though Wade didn't know her name yet, watched between bites. Not with suspicion, but with calculation. Wade met her eyes once, then looked away, careful not to press. Her expression told him enough. She had been making decisions for too long. Carrying weight meant for more than one person. The tension in her jaw spoke of survival chosen over rest, again and again. The softer woman, Ela, released a slow breath as warmth reached her stomach. Kyle, the taller one, stayed alert, eyes flicking towards the windows and the door with the same instincts Wade had honed over years of dangerous work. And Nira, the youngest, sat close to the wall, arms wrapped around herself as the cold finally began to loosen its grip. Wade lowered himself onto a bedroll near the stove, the firelight catching the scars on his knuckles and the worn leather of his boots. He didn't sleep. He listened instead, to breathing that slowly eased, to a room that no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, the silence inside his home felt different. And though he didn't say it aloud, Wade knew this night marked a turn he hadn't been searching for, but couldn't ignore. The youngest, Nira, sat close to the wall, arms folded tightly around herself as the cold finally loosened its grip on her body. Wade Mercer dragged a bedroll closer to the stove and eased himself down onto it. Firelight flickered across his scarred hands and the worn leather of his boots. Sleep pressed at him, heavy and persistent, but he didn't close his eyes. Instead, he listened. 4 different patterns of breathing filled the room, uneven at first, then gradually slowing. Not calm yet, but no longer sharp with panic. It struck him how long it had been since he'd shared a room with anyone at all. Unease stirred in him, not born of danger, but of change. Beneath it, something else took shape, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He didn't know why these women were running, but he knew it wasn't just hunger driving them forward. The way they held themselves spoke of a threat still breathing somewhere behind them, something unfinished, something that would not simply fade with rest. He didn't know why they had chosen his ranch, or whether he was ready for whatever their presence might bring. Still, he felt it, a quiet sense of responsibility settling in his chest. The wind shook the shutters. Ashira watched the movement with a tight jaw before finally letting her shoulders ease. The others followed her lead, allowing themselves to settle into the safety of the room. Wade stared up at the ceiling, warmth spreading slowly into his hands. For the first time in years, the silence inside his home felt altered. No longer hollow, no longer pressing in from every wall. And though he would never say it out loud, he knew this night marked a turn in his life he hadn't been searching for, but couldn't deny. Morning came without ceremony. Pale gray light spilled across the yard as the early chill crept through the gaps in the wooden walls. Wade woke before the women, lying still on the bedroll near the stove. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior. The fire had burned down to embers, a faint glow trapped beneath blackened logs. His back protested the hard floor, but he ignored it and listened instead. Soft breaths filled the cabin. 4 distinct rhythms. None frantic, none strained. Each sounded steadier than the night before. They had needed rest more than they'd admitted. Wade rose carefully, mindful not to wake them. He pulled on his boots and crossed to the door with practiced quiet. Outside, the cold bit hard at his face. Frost clung to the fence rails like thin white paint. He stepped off the porch, testing his weight on his injured leg. The joint stiffened under the cold, but he worked through it with familiar patience. Dust and cinder shifted in the corral, their breath lifting in pale clouds. Wade checked the gate, scattered feed into the troughs, and rubbed the muzzle of the older gelding. As he worked, his thoughts drifted back to the women inside. They had crossed open land on foot. None had spoken of husbands. None had mentioned clans or homes left behind. He didn't expect answers, but he knew their arrival hadn't been chance. When he returned to the porch, Ashira stood in the doorway. She hadn't made a sound. Her hair was loosely braided down her back, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes swept the yard with deliberate focus, measuring the land for danger rather than beauty. Wade stopped a few steps away, giving her room. She wasn't afraid. She looked prepared, ready for the day, ready for what might follow, ready to shift out of survival mode. "You can step outside if you want," Wade said quietly, his voice rough with sleep. Ashira moved onto the porch, bare feet touching the cold boards as she held the blanket close. She didn't answer him. Instead, her gaze traveled across the horizon, then settled on the corral. She watched the horses for a moment and exhaled, grounding herself. The door creaked open behind her. Ela peeked out, her expression softer now, less guarded. She blinked against the cold and stepped onto the porch, a patched shawl pulled tight around her dress. Her hands trembled briefly, then steadied as she took in the quiet land. Kyle followed, tall and watchful, her posture rigid with vigilance. Nira came last, rubbing her arms for warmth, eyes still heavy with sleep. Wade didn't crowd them. He leaned against a porch post and let them take it in. After fear, a place needed time to feel real. Inside, he relit the stove and set a pot of water to heat. One by one, the women returned, drawn by warmth. Wade prepared a simple breakfast, oats and boiled water, and placed 5 bowls on the table. He sat at the far end, careful not to box them in. As they ate, the cabin settled into a different kind of silence. The tension from the night before had eased, replaced by something fragile but present, a small, cautious sense of safety. Ashira finished slowly. When she set her bowl down, she spoke for the first time since arriving. "We didn't plan to stop here," she said, "but we had to choose a place before dark." Wade met her eyes without pressing. "You can stay through the day," he replied. "Weather's still cold." "You need time to get your footing," Wade said quietly. Kale's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in calculation. She studied him the way a seasoned scout reads open ground, measuring intent rather than words. In her world, trust wasn't given. It was earned, step by step. Nira reached for a second serving, then hesitated, her hand hovering as if waiting for permission. Wade slid the pot closer to her, without a word. Color rose in her cheeks, but she accepted the food. As she ate, her shoulders eased, tension slowly draining away. When breakfast ended, the women moved carefully through the cabin, mindful of the space. Ayla folded blankets with quiet precision. Nira gathered the bowls and washed them. Kael checked the windows and corners, memorizing the layout of the house. Ashira stood in the doorway, watching Wade as he stepped outside to split wood. He brought the axe down in controlled arcs, each strike cracking the stillness. Ashira observed long enough to learn his rhythm before stepping closer, bending to clear fallen bark from the ground. She worked with purpose, not seeking approval, only balance. "You don't have to help," Wade said, not lifting his gaze. "We should," Ashira replied. "We're using your land." There was no apology in her voice, only practicality. Wade respected that. Kyle joined them, stacking the split logs with steady, methodical movements. Ayla swept the porch using a small brush she found by the door. Nira drifted toward the corral, stopping at a careful distance as she studied the horses with quiet curiosity. The ranch, usually silent and still, filled with slow, deliberate motion. Nothing hurried, nothing forced. Their presence altered the place. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Wade paused when he noticed Ashira staring toward the horizon again. She wasn't admiring the land. She was tracing paths in her mind. Roots, threats, unfinished matters, whatever had driven them here hadn't ended. He didn't ask, but the weight of it pressed closer all the same. As the sun climbed higher, Ashira spoke again, her voice low. "We don't know how long we can keep moving." Wade listened without interruption. It wasn't a request, not yet, but it leaned in that direction. "We left everything behind," she continued. "We're not looking to bring trouble." Wade tightened his grip on the axe handle. "Trouble doesn't wait to be invited," he said quietly. Ashira held his gaze. Fear wasn't there anymore, only exhaustion and resolve. Inside the cabin, Nira let out a soft laugh at something Ayla whispered. The sound was brief and fragile, but real. Wade turned back to the woodpile, aware of what he wasn't ready to say aloud. Their arrival hadn't been chance. The land had drawn them here, and his quiet life was already shifting beyond repair. The morning stretched into a colder, steadier light as clouds gathered overhead, dulling every color across the range. Wade stepped out with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, planning to check the west fence before the wind turned. The air felt heavy, damp with the promise of weather. Dust and cinder shifted restlessly in the pen, tossing their heads as if sensing the change ahead of him. Before reaching the barn, Wade noticed Nira standing near the corral gate. She didn't approach. She watched him with cautious curiosity, her hair loosely brushed but still tangled from travel. When she caught his eye, she straightened, clearly embarrassed to be standing idle. She lifted her hand slightly toward the horses. A silent question. Wade gave a short nod toward the mare closest to the fence. Nira stepped forward, careful, unhurried. The mare sniffed her fingers, then relaxed almost at once. Nira's shoulders softened as she stroked the animal's neck with practiced ease. Wade took note. She wasn't new to horses. Whatever life she'd known before had required patience and quiet understanding. While Nira tended the mare, Wade stepped into the barn to gather a hammer and nails. The door creaked as he came back out. This time, Coyle stood several paces away, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tree line. She wasn't watching the ranch. She was watching for anything that didn't belong. Wade recognized that look, from scouts, from old soldiers, people who never believed danger was gone just because the night had passed. "Expecting someone?" Wade asked, his tone even. Kyle shook her head slightly. "Just making sure nothing followed us." He didn't press. The tightness in her voice said she wasn't ready to explain. Wade turned toward the far end of the fence. Footsteps followed. Ashira joined him, stopping at a respectful distance. She carried herself with controlled composure. The set of her eyes told him she hadn't slept deeply. "I'll help," she said simply. Wade Mercer handed her a spare pair of gloves. Ashira slipped them on without hesitation. They moved along the fence together, falling into a quiet rhythm that needed no words. Wade drove loose boards back into place with steady blows. Ashira cleared branches and debris from the base, her attention drifting now and then toward the creek, as if she expected the land itself to answer her stare. Her awareness wasn't nervous. It was trained. Someone who had learned the hard way not to trust stillness. As they worked, Wade caught himself studying her face in brief glances. Ashira wasn't fragile. She wasn't intimidated by the land, or by him. But exhaustion lingered in her eyes, deep and unresolved. A struggle she hadn't named, yet carried all the same. When they reached the section closest to the creek, Ashira stopped. She knelt and brushed aside disturbed soil, her expression tightened. "What is it?" Wade asked. "A track," she said quietly. "Old, but not ours." Wade crouched beside her. The print was faint, nearly erased by wind and animals, but it didn't belong to anyone he knew. A pressure settled in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. They hadn't gone unnoticed. "How long?" Wade asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Ashira replied. "Hard to say. Last night's rain softened the edges." Wade straightened slowly. The air felt heavier around them, though the trees remained still. Back at the house, Ayla warmed water over the stove. The smell of broth drifted through the open doorway. She looked up when they entered, relief flickering across her face at the sight of them unharmed. Neera came in soon after, cheeks flushed from the cold, bits of horsehair clinging to her sleeves. Kyle stayed near the front window, watching the creek from another angle. She was tense, but not panicked. More like someone refusing to be caught unaware again. Wade set the hammer down on the table. "There's a track by the creek," he said evenly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sharpen the words. The truth alone shifted the room. Ayla froze, spoon hovering over the pot. Neera lowered herself into a chair, fingers tightening on the edge. Ashira showed no fear, only focus, as if the discovery confirmed something she already suspected. Kyle didn't turn from the window. "It could be nothing," Wade added. "A ranch hand passing through weeks ago." Ashira shook her head. "No ranch hand crosses there. The ground's too soft. People avoid it unless they're trying not to be seen." Wade absorbed that carefully. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but her certainty came from experience, not guesswork. "You're being followed," he said, not as an accusation, but as fact. Kyle finally turned, jaw tightening. "We left someone behind who doesn't accept no." "If he finds our trail," she continued, "he won't stop." Ayla swallowed hard. Neera stared at the floor, fingers curling into her dress. Ashira lifted her chin, her voice steady. "We didn't come here to drag you into this. We just needed a place to breathe." Wade didn't answer right away. He understood how violence clung to people, how it followed like a shadow. He'd lived with it long enough to know running only delayed the reckoning. "You're safe for now," he said at last. "We'll watch the land together." Relief didn't flood the room, but something shifted. A steadiness settled in. Quiet, solid, the kind that came from knowing someone hadn't turned away after hearing the truth. The day moved on with measured work. Ayla prepared food. Neera brushed dust and cinder again. Kyle walked the perimeter, learning every line and corner. Ashira carried wood inside, her steps heavy but controlled. Wade watched them move through his space, not as intruders, not as guests, but as people piecing a life back together one careful action at a time. For the first time in years, the ranch felt less like a place built for isolation, and more like the beginning of something he hadn't been looking for, but couldn't stop from forming. The sky darkened earlier than expected that afternoon. Heavy clouds stacked over the hills, muting the land into shadow. A cold wind swept across the ranch, carrying the scent of distant rain and settling unease into every quiet corner. Wade Mercer pulled the collar of his coat tighter as he finished securing a fresh length of rope to the barn's support beam. The air carried a strange weight today, dense, muffled, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He didn't speak the thought aloud, but he felt it in the sharp prickle along his spine. Inside the house, Ashira sorted through the tools they had gathered earlier, placing each one on the table with careful precision. It was the kind of order Wade recognized, born not from habit, but from survival. Each time the wind slammed the shutters, she paused. Not in fear, in readiness. Rest hadn't dulled her alertness. It had sharpened it. Ela moved quietly between the stove and the counter, focused on preparing a small pan of cornbread. She wasn't humming today. Her hands trembled whenever the shutters rattled, nerves still raw after months of running. She tried to hide it by working faster, but the shaking lingered all the same. Kyle stayed outside longer than the others, walking a wide perimeter around the ranch with deliberate steps. At every corner of the property, she stopped, scanned the distant ridges, then moved on. When she finally returned to the porch, her expression was tight, but controlled. She hadn't seen anyone. That didn't mean she trusted the emptiness. Nira remained near the corral, brushing dust and cinder with slow, even strokes. She spoke softly to them in her native tongue, so quiet it barely carried. But the horses responded, their movements calm and steady. The tension around her eyes had softened since arriving, yet she still flinched when a strong gust cut through the pen. Wade walked up to the fence where she worked. "They're easy with you," he said. Nira looked up, a flicker of guarded pride crossing her face. "Horses don't lie," she replied quietly. "They don't hide fear." The truth of it struck Wade deeper than he expected. People hid everything. He left her to her work and crossed the yard toward Ashira, who stood near the back of the house holding a broken latch she'd pulled from the rear window. She lifted it slightly. "This won't hold if someone pushes hard enough." Wade examined the wood. Rot had eaten into the edge, something he'd overlooked. Solitude had made him careless in places he'd once checked often. "I'll fix it now," he said. "I'll hold it," Ashira replied. Inside, they worked side by side at the back window. Wade positioned a new wooden brace, while Ashira pressed it firmly into place. Their faces were close enough for him to see the faint lines of exhaustion etched across her brow. Marks left by too many nights, listening for footsteps outside borrowed shelters. He drove the nails in, each strike echoing through the room. As they worked, Ela checked the pot on the stove and spoke softly. "We didn't expect anyone to help us again." Wade paused, caught off guard by the quiet honesty. "You needed a place," he said. "That's all." "That's more than we've had in a long time," she murmured, not looking up. Kyle stepped inside then, brushing dirt from her hands. "I saw nothing around the property," she said. Her voice was steady. "No tracks?" "None?" Wade asked. "None," she confirmed. "But absence doesn't mean safety." Nira came in behind her, carrying a breath of cold air. "The horses are uneasy," she said. "Not frightened, just restless." The room stilled. The women exchanged glances, not panic, but understanding. They trusted the land more than words. Wade folded his arms. If anything comes, we'll see it before it reaches the house. Ashira studied him closely. You speak like someone who's been hunted. He didn't deny it. Everyone's got a past, he said. I've lived mine long enough to know danger doesn't announce itself. She accepted that with a small nod, not pressing for what he didn't offer. As evening settled, Ela served the cornbread alongside a simple stew she'd put together. The meal was quiet, but warm. For the first time, Kyle sat without keeping her hand near the knife on the table. Nira laughed softly at something Ela whispered. Ashira watched the room, a careful hope taking shape beneath her stern expression. Wade ate slowly, observing without staring. He wasn't used to sharing a table. The realization tightened something in his chest. Not discomfort, but a stirring he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't responsible for these women. Still, he couldn't shake the instinct to protect the fragile peace forming here. After the meal, the wind eased, though the clouds overhead remained heavy. Wade stepped onto the porch, his boots striking the boards with a dull, steady sound. Cold cut straight through Wade Mercer's coat the moment he stepped onto the porch. He swept his gaze along the tree line with the practiced focus of a man who knew how danger hid. Between shadows, behind stillness, inside places that looked empty, but weren't. The door creaked behind him. Ashira stepped out, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't move to stand beside him. She stayed just behind, careful not to intrude, yet unable to remain inside while uncertainty pressed against the land. It feels different tonight, she said quietly. Wade didn't turn, but his answer carried the same weight. It does. After a pause, she asked, steady but edged with something exposed. Do you regret letting us stay? No, he said without hesitation, but I want to understand what you're carrying. Ashira drew a slow breath, the cold fogging in front of her. We'll tell you soon, just not yet. He accepted that. She wasn't withholding trust, she was guarding it. Behind them, lantern light spilled through the doorway, stretching their shadows across the porch boards. Two people shaped by different kinds of danger stood near one another, neither naming the fear settling over the land, neither stepping away from it. Above the ranch, clouds thickened, gathering toward a turning point neither could yet see. By dawn, frost glazed the ground, the cold bit harder than the day before, settling into the earth like a warning lodged deep in the gut. Wade stepped outside before the sun fully rose, pulling his coat close as the chill reached the old scars along his arms. His breath cut dark against the pale air as he headed toward the creek. He wasn't checking the ground out of paranoia. He was following instinct, the quiet certainty that yesterday's unease had been justified. Grass bent beneath his boots as he reached the far post. When he crouched near the washed soil, he saw it immediately. A footprint, clearer than the one before, pressed deep enough that the rain hadn't erased it. Someone had passed through recently. Wade traced the edge of the print with his fingers, feeling the hardened shape beneath the cold surface. Whoever it was carried weight and intent, and hadn't cared about hiding their trail. He rose slowly, early light sharpening the tension in his shoulders. Footsteps approached behind him, measured and alert. Ashira emerged from the thinning shadows near the house, her blanket pulled close, her eyes already awake. She studied his face first, not the ground, reading the change instantly. You found something, she said. Fresh, Wade replied. Not a ranch hand, not mine. She stepped closer and examined the print herself. Her swallow was small, but it told him enough. She knew exactly what it meant. He's closing in, Ashira said quietly. He always moved faster than we did. Wade heard the strain beneath her calm. Fear didn't rule her, but it stayed close enough to shape every choice. She wasn't talking about a stranger. She was talking about someone who believed pursuit was owed to him. "We didn't outrun him," she added. "But we can slow him down." Wade nodded, his thoughts already shifting toward preparation. This wasn't new territory for him. They returned to the house together. Inside, Cale stood near the window, restless in the gray morning light. Her eyes snapped to Wade's expression. "What happened?" she asked, tension tightening her voice. "Someone crossed through after the rain," Wade said evenly. Ayla stopped stirring the pot. Neera's hand froze mid-stroke through her hair. The air tightened, sudden and sharp. "He's tracking us," Cale said, jaw locking. Ashira shot her a steady look. "We don't know it's him," she said, though the certainty in her voice had thinned. Wade didn't interrupt. He crossed to the supply shelf and pulled down tools he hadn't touched in years. Silence settled as he returned with a hammer, nails, and 2 lengths of chain. Ashira stepped closer. "What are you planning?" "Reinforcement," Wade said. "Barn doors, gate hinges, back window, secured from the outside." "And us?" Cale asked. Wade looked at each of them, not with command, but with clarity. "You help where you feel steady. If you're tired, you rest. If you're unsure, you stay close to the house. No one goes past the corral without saying so." Their expressions tightened, not in resistance, but in understanding. What came next would require awareness, patience, and trust. And none of them intended to face it unprepared. It wasn't fear that unsettled them. It was the unfamiliar weight of being included in a decision rather than commanded. Ashira stepped forward first. "We'll carry our part," she said. The work began without delay. Ayla fetched buckets of fresh water and set them just inside the door, her hands trembling only at the start before steadying. Neera cleared debris from around the barn, stacking broken branches away from the walls so the ground would show any fresh prints clearly. Kyle walked the perimeter again, this time counting her steps, noting where the soil stayed soft the longest. Wade Mercer inspected the barn doors and fastened the first chain as sharp gusts of wind cut through the yard. Ashira followed him to the back of the house, where a window frame had loosened. She braced the boards while he drove each nail in with controlled strength. Their breath rose in pale clouds. Neither spoke until the final nail was set. "You've done this before," Ashira said quietly. Wade didn't deny it. "I've seen places fall apart because no one acted soon enough." That answer made her pause. She studied his profile as he adjusted the last hinge. His silence wasn't empty. It came from someone who had known violence and learned how to hold it at a distance. Inside, Ayla laid out food on the table. Plain bread, beans, and warm water. The simplicity didn't matter. The care did. When Wade came in, she handed him a bowl without asking. He accepted it with a nod, and some of the tension slipped from her shoulders. They all ate standing, too restless to sit. No one spoke about leaving. No one mentioned running again. The decision settled without words. They would not abandon the ranch simply because fear drew near. They would prepare, stay alert, and hold ground together. After the meal, Wade stepped onto the porch. Ashira followed, keeping a few paces back, giving him space. He leaned against the railing, eyes locked on the distant ridge. The tight line of his jaw returned, an old habit he'd thought buried with his former life. Ashira watched him closely. "You're not doing this only for us," she said. "No," Wade replied. "This is my land. I won't let danger cross it unseen." She nodded, understanding more than he'd said. Silence stretched between them, Not uncomfortable, but weighted with clarity. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. She was no longer just someone seeking it. Inside, Kyle closed the shutters one by one. Nira fed dust and cinder extra hay to keep them calm through the night. Ela folded blankets near the stove, arranging them where someone could sleep fully dressed if needed. The ranch no longer felt like a place they were passing through. It felt like ground being defended. When Wade finally turned toward Ashira, his voice held no doubt. "If he comes here," he said, "we face him together." Ashira drew a sharp breath. Not from fear, but from something close to relief. For the first time in a long while, someone was choosing to stand with them instead of turning away. That single truth changed everything about the hours that followed. Morning rose behind a thin veil of haze, casting a washed-out light across the ranch. The cold lingered, slipping through the seams of the house and settling into the yard. Wade stepped outside before the women woke, wanting to get ahead of the day. He carried a lantern and his old field knife, scanning the property with the sharp awareness that had once kept him alive. His jaw tightened as he reached the boundary near the creek. The ground remained undisturbed. No new prints, no signs of movement. The absence didn't ease him. It only deepened the uncertainty. Behind him, the door opened with a soft creak. Kyle stepped onto the porch, her hair tied back tight, posture alert though the morning had barely begun. She didn't greet him. She simply joined him at the edge of the yard, eyes narrowing as she studied the hills. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. "Didn't feel right," Wade answered. Kyle nodded once. For the first time, her expression held something other than guarded tension. She respected readiness. Inside, Ela stoked the stove, feeding small logs until the flames burned steady. The warmth eased her shaking hands, though worry stayed lodged beneath her ribs. She kept busy, setting out cups, draping blankets over chairs, tidying corners that didn't need it, movement as a way to keep her thoughts from racing too far ahead. Nira stepped outside moments later, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She walked toward the corral with gentle care, checking each horse in turn. Even the skittish gelding lowered his head to her palm. Her bond with the animals had deepened with each passing day, and in the quiet of the early morning the ranch held its breath, aware that whatever came next would test not only their vigilance, but the fragile unity they had begun to build. The horses steadied her in ways she didn't yet have words for. They offered something solid, something that didn't judge, didn't question, didn't demand explanations. Ashira was the last to step out of the house. She carried herself differently now, her shoulders squared with a strength that hadn't been there when she first arrived. The long night had taken its toll, but exhaustion no longer ruled her face. She stopped beside Wade Mercer without asking what he had seen. "Any new signs?" she asked. "None," Wade replied. "But quiet doesn't always mean safe." Ashira studied him closely. "Men like him know when to stay awake," she said. "He doesn't rush. He closes in until there's nowhere left to run." Wade didn't flinch at the truth. "If he's hiding, he'll show himself when he thinks you're worn down," he said. "That's how men like that work." Ashira drew a slow breath, cold air filling her lungs. "He expects us to be alone," she said. "Weak. Easy." "Then let him be wrong," Wade answered. They went back inside, where the others waited. The room felt heavier than the day before. Not with fear, but with the weight of choices drawing close. Wade laid several items on the table. Rope, nails, 2 sharpened stakes, and a coil of wire he hadn't touched in years. Coil crossed her arms, eyes narrowing as she took it in. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "I'm setting signals around the property," Wade said. If anything crosses the boundary, we'll hear it. I'll show you the pattern so you know the sound. Ela swallowed. And inside? The doors, the windows? We reinforced them again today, Wade replied. Furniture gets pulled away from the back walls. No one gets cornered. Nira lifted her chin, surprising the others with her resolve. I'll handle the horses. If something happens, they need to stay calm. Wade nodded. Do that. Keep them ready, but not restless. They moved like a small unit now, each person finding their place without orders or hesitation. Outside, Wade showed them how to string the wire between fence posts. Ashira held the posts steady while he wrapped the metal tight. Kale followed behind, testing each section with a careful tug. Small pieces of tin were tied along the line so even the lightest disturbance would rattle. The work was slow, deliberate. Each step pushed the ranch closer to readiness. At the barn, Nira brushed dust and cinder again, speaking to them in a low, steady voice, telling them to stay calm, telling them she was there. The horses shifted uneasily at first, sensing the change in the air, but her calm anchored them. Ayla spent the morning boiling water and preparing a thick stew. She tasted it twice, adding more herbs than usual, wanting the warmth to reach deeper than hunger. Cooking gave her purpose, something she could do without shaking. By midday, the sky began to clear, though the cold held firm. Wade drove the last stake into the ground and stepped back. For the first time since the women arrived, he allowed himself a brief breath. Ashira joined him, wiping dirt from her hands. You're doing more than offering shelter, she said quietly. You're preparing to protect us. Wade kept his eyes on the horizon. I'm protecting the ranch, he said, and you're part of it now. She held his words for a long moment, accepting them not as kindness, but as fact. Inside, the stew filled the room with warmth. They ate sitting closer together than before, the unspoken understanding settling between them. They were now bound to the same danger and the same safety. As the sun dropped behind the hills, Wade walked the perimeter one last time. No new tracks, no movement, only the occasional groan of wood tightening in the cold. When he returned, Ashira stood on the porch, waiting. She didn't speak right away, only searched his face for doubt. He gave none. The day passed quiet, Wade said. That doesn't mean the night will. Ashira stepped closer, her voice steady. Whatever comes, we won't face it alone. For the first time since she arrived, her eyes held no defeat, only readiness. Wade nodded once. The ranch was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a line they would defend together. Darkness settled over the land, and none of them stepped away from the truth they now shared. Morning came under a pale, washed-out light that offered no warmth. The wind had turned in the night, dragging colder air down from the northern ridge, bending the brittle grass toward the creek and carrying a faint scent from far off, something distant, unsettled. Wade Mercer woke before the others again, the unfamiliar pull of responsibility hauling him out of sleep. He sat up on the bedroll and listened to the house breathe, the low creak of settling boards, embers snapping softly in the stove, the quiet, even breaths from the corner where Nira and Ela slept. He rose and stepped outside, boots touching the frost-slick porch without a sound. The land looked still, but stillness no longer meant safety. He swept the ridgelines with the sharpened focus of a man who once tracked dangerous people for weeks at a time. Nothing moved. No figures, no horses, no dust. Still, the smell in the air bothered him, faint but unmistakable. Not fire, not ranch smoke, something else he couldn't yet name. Kyle joined him moments later, pulling her coat tight. She didn't offer a greeting. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon the same way his were. "You smell it too," she said. "Yeah," Wade replied. "Can't place it." "Old campsite," Coyle said. "The kind left by men who never stay long." Wade didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her words matched what his instincts had already told him. Inside, Ayla stirred awake, rubbing sleep from her eyes as the stove warmed her face. She went straight to boiling water again, hands steadier than they'd been days before. Cooking had become her anchor. This morning, she moved faster, sensing the tension without hearing the conversation outside. Neera slipped onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't speak at first, only watched the horses as they shifted uneasily. The gelding snorted, stamping the frozen ground. Neera ran a calming hand along its neck, whispering steady words in her language until its breathing slowed. Her calm mattered. The animals answered it more readily than anything else. Ashira joined Wade last. She stepped onto the porch with her arms crossed tight, jaw set. She didn't ask what was wrong. The air itself told her enough. "What direction?" she asked. Wade pointed toward the northern ridge. "Something burned up there, not a wildfire. Too cold, controlled." Ashira scanned the ridge in long, measured sweeps. "He's signaling," she murmured. Wade turned slightly toward her. "Signaling who?" Her eyes dropped briefly before she answered. "He travels with 2 men now. They weren't with him at first. They joined later, after things turned bad." Kyle stepped closer. "They owe him. He pulled one of them out of a raid years ago. They follow him without question." Wade absorbed that in silence. 3 pursuers changed everything. Not impossible, but far more dangerous for a small ranch with 4 worn-down women inside. "We need a plan," Wade said. "We've been making one," Ashira replied. "Just not out loud." They gathered inside around the table, a pot of oats simmering quietly between them. The room felt smaller, not from fear, but from decisions that could no longer wait. Wade spread out a rough map of the property he'd drawn years ago, its edges softened from folding. Kyle leaned over it, tracing the ridgeline with her finger. "They'll come from here," she said. "He favors high ground, likes a clear approach." Wade nodded. "I'll take the north. If he comes down the slope, I'll see him first." Ela shook her head at once, voice trembling but firm. "Not alone. You don't know how he works." Wade lifted a brow. Ela rarely spoke with such certainty. Ashira stepped in. "He doesn't strike the strongest first. He looks for the one left apart. He hits weakness, not the front." Wade's expression tightened, not with anger, but adjustment. "Then we stay together. No one moves out of sight." Neera spoke next, quiet but steady. "What if they go for the horses? They could spook them on purpose." Wade tapped the barn on the map. "We bring them inside and bar the door from within. Make it hard to reach them." Heads nodded around the table. The shape of the plan sharpened as they spoke. Ashira and Coyle would watch the west and north windows. Ayla would prepare water and blankets in case they needed to retreat deeper into the house. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, and the ranch, once a lonely refuge, settled into the stillness of a place preparing to be tested. Neera would keep the animals calm and help secure the barn. Wade Mercer would brace the porch rail and build a second barricade just behind the front door. Once the plan was settled, no one hesitated. The ranch shifted into motion. Wade drove thick boards across the lower porch railing, each nail struck with measured force. Hard enough to hold, careful enough not to split the wood. Ashira checked the shutters again, tightening the metal hooks until they bit firm. Kyle traced escape routes around the house, clearing loose stones and debris so no one would stumble if they had to move fast. Hila filled every container she could find with water, unsure whether it would be needed to drink, to clean wounds, or to smother fire. Nira led Dust and Cinder into the barn, speaking to them in low, steady tones until their nerves eased. By afternoon, the ranch no longer felt like a solitary homestead. It looked like a place braced for trouble. When the sun sank, the sky bruised into deep violet and the cold sharpened. Wade stepped outside one last time to study the ridge. Far off, a thin column of smoke rose, stretched, and vanished into the wind. Ashira joined him, her breath fogging in the air. "He's telling us he's close." Wade didn't blink. "Good. Then I know where to look." She searched his face for a long moment. "You don't have to do this for us." Wade met her eyes with quiet certainty. "This isn't only about you anymore." The truth of it caught in her chest. Not romantic, not dramatic, just solid and real. Inside, lantern light glowed soft and steady, as the others prepared in silence. Wade stepped back in and closed the door. The ranch held firm beneath the darkening sky. They waited. Every person inside understood what that meant. Whatever was coming would arrive soon, and no one was leaving the place unguarded. The night passed without attack, but the silence felt heavy, as if the valley itself had been pressed flat by unseen weight. Dawn came colder than any morning since they arrived. Frost lined the corral posts in thick white bands, and mist clung low to the ground like breath caught against the earth. Wade woke to the soft groan of wood tightening in the cold. He dressed quietly and stepped outside. The sun barely crested the horizon. The sky washed pale blue and dull gold. His eyes went straight to the ridge, searching for movement. Shadow, horse, dust. Anything. Nothing stirred. It brought no comfort. Inside, Ashira sat near the stove, already dressed, her face tight with calculation rather than fatigue. Cale sat opposite her, slowly sharpening a small blade taken from Wade's toolbox, movements calm and practiced, someone who had learned survival long before this ranch. Ayla stirred warm water, trying to hide her nerves, but her fingers betrayed her, knuckles whitening around the ladle. Nira fed the fire, pushing wood deeper into the flames, her breath briefly clouding the air. Wade came in and shut the door. "No movement yet." He didn't offer reassurance. Empty comfort had no place here. Ashira stood. "He's waiting for us to loosen up. He wants us tired, cold, nervous, arguing." Kyle set the blade on the table. "Then we don't give him that. If he comes from the north, we use the porch barricade. If he swings behind us, the barn door holds long enough to move." Hila stepped closer, worry tightening her voice. "What if he brings more men than you expect?" Wade met her gaze evenly. "Then we adjust. We don't panic." Nira brushed ash from her hands. "The horses are alert. They'll know before we do." Ashira turned to Wade, steady-eyed. "What's today's plan?" Wade unrolled the old property map again. "We keep preparing, but we need a vantage point. If I can see from higher ground, I'll know exactly where he is." Cale frowned. "You want the ridge?" "Not the top," Wade said. "Just high enough." Hila's breath caught. "Alone." Wade nodded. "It's faster." Ashira stepped forward at once. "I'm going with you." Wade shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is," she said firmly. "He doesn't know your habits. He knows ours. He knows how we move. If you miss a sign, I won't." Wade Mercer held Ashira's gaze for several long seconds. She wasn't being reckless. She was being honest. She understood the man tracking them in ways Wade didn't. And if he was going to hold this ranch, he needed that knowledge. "All right," Wade said at last. "But we move careful. No open ground unless we have to." Kyle watched Ashira with worry. but didn't argue. She knew Ashira wouldn't be talked out of it. Nira stepped forward and draped a shawl over Ashira's shoulders. "Come back," she murmured. "We will," Ashira answered. They slipped out together, angling behind the barn to avoid open sight lines as they headed toward the north ridge. The wind came in steady gusts, sharp with the scent of cold stone and drying grass. Wade walked a few steps ahead, reading the land the way he once had when survival depended on it. Ashira matched his pace, her attention split between the ground and the trees. She stopped him twice, once for a snapped twig bent the wrong way, once for a shallow depression pressed into the soil. Then she crouched and pointed to a faint thread of fabric snagged low on a branch. Wade would have missed it. It was nearly colorless. "Someone passed through?" Ashira said softly. "Not close enough to strike, close enough to watch." Wade's hand tightened around his knife. "How far does he keep?" "He likes distance," she replied. "He waits until he's sure no one's ready." They climbed in short bursts, pausing often to listen. When they reached a low ledge, Wade dropped behind a boulder and signaled her down. Beyond them stretched a wide patch of timber broken by narrow ravines. They scanned slowly. "There," Ashira whispered. Wade followed her finger. Deep in the trees, something shifted, fabric brushing branches. A man knelt, adjusting something on the ground. The slope was steep, but the posture was unmistakable. "He's marking his path," Ashira said. "He'll move closer when he decides." Wade felt his heartbeat slow. Not from fear, but from certainty. "We head back. We know what's coming." Ashira lingered a moment longer, her face tight with old memory. Then she nodded and followed him down. When they reached the ranch, the others waited on the porch. No one spoke until they were close. "You saw him?" Cale said. "Yes," Wade replied. "North side. He's not rushing, but he's close." Hila's face drained. "So he's attacking today?" "Not today," Wade said firmly. "He's setting the ground." "He's closer than before," Ashira added. "He wants us boxed in." "Then we don't panic," Nira said. Ashira looked at her with quiet respect. Wade let out a slow breath. "We're ready. We're not giving up ground. Not here." They went back inside as the wind rose, rattling the roof. Everyone carried the same understanding now. The danger wasn't distant anymore. It had direction, intent, and Wade knew the final encounter wasn't a question of if. It was coming. Measured, deliberate, step by step. A thin gray dawn crept over the valley, flattening shadows and sharpening every shape. Wade stepped onto the porch as soon as the horizon lightened, coat pulled tight against the cold. The wind had died sometime in the night, leaving the air unnervingly still. No birds, no movement, a silence that demanded attention. Inside, the women woke one by one. After days of strain, each felt the difference immediately. Something had shifted, not in danger, but in resolve. They were done running. The ranch wasn't a stop anymore. It was ground they had chosen to hold. Cale tied her hair back with a firm knot and slid the small blade she'd sharpened the day before into her waistband. Not out of fear, but readiness. Ayla cleared the table and folded blankets with steady hands for the first morning since they arrived. She wasn't shaking anymore. Survival had given her something solid to stand on, and her composure followed. Nira went to the barn early, leading Dust and Cinder into the yard so they could move freely. Their steps were steady today, not jittery. Animals sensed conflict before people did. And this morning they carried something different. Resolve. Ashira was the last to step outside. She found Wade Mercer near the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the ridge where they'd spotted the watcher the day before. She studied his face, searching for strain. Instead, she found quiet certainty settling in his features. "He'll move today," Ashira said. "Maybe," Wade replied, "but we're ready now." There was no fear between them, only clarity. They gathered at the table for a simple breakfast. No one raised their voice. No one hurried when they finished. Each person went to the place they'd chosen around the ranch. Wade took the porch, closest to the north. Ashira positioned herself by the kitchen window. Kyle watched the western fence line. Ayla stayed inside with water and blankets close at hand. Nira remained near the barn doors, calming the horses with her presence. The hours stretched on. The sun climbed, warming the frost until water dripped steadily from the rails. Nothing moved along the ridge. No figures, no smoke. Wade's jaw tightened slightly as he kept scanning. Patience was a skill he'd learned the hard way. Most fights were decided by who stayed steady the longest. Near midday, Ashira joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of warm water, steam lifting faintly. "He's waiting for us to slip," she said, handing one to him. "Then we don't," Wade answered after a slow sip. She stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. For the first time since she'd arrived, her face showed a trace of peace, as if she finally trusted the ground beneath her boots. Minutes slid into an hour. The ridge stayed empty. Kyle approached carefully. "Either he's gone, or he's not coming." Ashira shook her head. "He doesn't walk away that easily." Wade kept his eyes on the hills. Something had shifted. He could feel it. The land no longer carried the sharp edge of tension from days before. It felt grounded, settled, almost relieved. Then, far off, a single rider appeared. Not close, not approaching, just moving along the ridge at an unhurried pace. Wade lifted the rifle slightly, not to fire, just to be sure. The rider didn't stop, didn't turn. He continued south, following a trail that led away from the ranch entirely. Kyle stared. Why would he leave? Ashira let out a slow breath as understanding set in. He watched long enough to see we're not prey anymore. He hunts people who fall apart, not people who stand together. Wade lowered the rifle. The rider shrank into the distance until he vanished behind the far ridge. It ended without gunfire, without shouting, just a man deciding his quarry wasn't worth the cost. Ashira leaned on the railing, breathing deeply. "I never thought he'd turn away." "He did," Wade said, "because you faced him with something stronger than fear." She met his gaze, steady. "Not alone." The others gathered gradually. Ayla wiped her hands on her skirt. Nira smiled faintly as the horses settled. Kale released a long breath she'd been holding for years. Inside, the weight that had filled every corner began to lift. The house felt lighter, warmer, lived in. Wade turned to them. "This place is safe now. You can stay as long as you want. No one here will drive you out." Ayla covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Nira nodded with quiet gratitude. Kyle stood taller, pride replacing old fear. Ashira walked toward Wade, each step firm and grounded. She stopped in front of him, searching his face. "You sure you want us here?" Wade didn't look away. "This ranch hasn't felt alive in years. I don't want it empty again." Her eyes softened, not with sentiment, but recognition. Belonging. The others closed in, forming a small circle. They weren't fugitives now. They weren't guests. They were home. By late afternoon, the fog lifted completely, revealing a wide, open sky. The ranch, once defined by solitude, now held voices, movement, and the first quiet promise of a shared future. Wade and Ashira stood side by side, watching the land they were responsible for together. No doubts, no shadows left on the ridge. The threat was gone. Fear no longer ruled them. The ranch had become a place for rebuilding. For the first time in a decade, Wade felt something settle inside him with calm finality. This was his family now. Ashira, Kyle, Ayla, Nira, women who had found their strength again under his roof. And for the first time since they arrived, Ashira allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Their lives had changed the moment they stepped onto this land. Now their future, together, felt certain, grounded, and peaceful. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: these stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.